The local news segment was buzzing about a new restaurant called Savor and Spice, and a dish that had critics raving. Then the host lifted the plate and said the name, Eric's Original Sauce, with the little circled R next to it.
That's the name I trademarked 40 years ago. How is that possible?
He turned off the television and walked into his study, his heart thudding against his ribs. Inside the cabinet was a yellowed envelope containing a single sheet of paper he hadn't looked at in decades. United States Patent and Trademark Office, registration number 15432XX, Sauce Magnifique, filed by John Hayes, 1988.
She named it. My mother Grace named it, and I swore I'd protect it.
Beside him on the desk sat the faded photograph of Grace Hayes, the woman who taught him every spice, every simmer.
He promised her he'd keep the recipe in the family. And now his own son was selling it as an original creation.
John stared at the certificate, the weight of an unspoken history pressing on his chest. He closed his eyes, and the years peeled away, back to the small kitchen where he first learned the recipe. Grace Hayes had a way with spices, a pinch of this, a dash of that, and a secret blend she called Sauce Magnifique.
Her voice echoed in his head. It's not just sauce, Johnny. It's us.
After she passed, he filed for the trademark in 1988, a quiet shield for a family treasure. But the real wound came years later, on a rain-soaked day at another grave. John and Eric had stood on opposite sides of the burial plot, neither able to bridge the silence.
He had been so angry, and so had Eric. They hadn't spoken since.
The words he'd meant to say about the recipe were buried in that silence, along with his wife. Opening his eyes, John looked at the certificate again, the registered trademark still faintly glowing on the paper.
He never knew. And now the whole city is eating my mother's sauce without knowing it's hers.
He picked up his tablet, the news clip still paused on Eric's face, and dialed Patricia Morales. An hour later, he sat across from her in her sleek office, the trademark certificate open on the table between them.
She adjusted her glasses, scanning the document. John, this is a registration from 1988. It's still active.
I know. I never told Eric.
Patricia pulled up the news segment on her own tablet, the symbol sharp on the menu.
This is willful. Damages could be substantial. What do you want to do, John?
No lawsuit. No damages. I want a licensing deal or a cease and desist with an offer. Something that protects the name but doesn't destroy him.
That's compassionate, given he didn't ask.
He didn't ask, but he's still my son.
Patricia nodded, tapping her pen. The cease and desist was now inevitable. Late that afternoon, Patricia walked into Savor and Spice, her blazer cutting through the warm dining room chatter. She ordered the house specialty, and when the menu arrived, she snapped a photo of the offending line.
Back in her office, she projected the menu image onto the screen for John. Sauce Magnifique with our signature blend.
John leaned closer. That's the name Grace gave it in 1955.
The symbol is printed intentionally. This is willful. Damages in a lawsuit could be 6 figures.
No lawsuit, Patricia. Draft the cease and desist and attach a licensing offer. Give him a choice.
She pulled out a legal pad and began to write, the terms shaped around a family olive branch.
John looked down at his hands. This might push him further away.
Or it might be how you finally talk. The law has a way of forcing conversations.
John nodded slowly, and the first draft of the letter came together in the quiet hum of the office. In the following days, Patricia finalized the cease and desist letter, attaching a fair licensing proposal, as John had requested. The letter opened with a single line. You are hereby notified that the mark Sauce Magnifique is a federally registered trademark.
She slid the finished draft toward John. It's ready. Once this goes out, there's no taking it back.
I know. John signed the authorization without hesitation. Mail it.
Later that afternoon, a certified envelope bearing Patricia's firm name was dropped into the mailbox, addressed to Eric Hayes.
Driving home, John couldn't shake the image of Eric's face the day they last spoke. Cold, closed, final.
He stood by the front window, watching the street, a habit from years when he still hoped Eric might pull up.
8 years of silence, and now a letter. What kind of father had he become?
The house was too quiet. The clock ticked, and the weight of every unsaid word settled deeper into the walls. John sat in his worn armchair, waiting for a response that could bring his son back, or push him away forever. 2 days later, a postal worker handed a certified envelope to a server at Savor and Spice's back door. The server found Eric in the kitchen and passed him the letter with a curious glance. He tore it open, and as his eyes scanned the brutal legal jargon, one name froze him: Sauce Magnifique.
He muttered to himself, "My sauce? That's impossible. I crafted every ingredient in my own kitchen."
His phone was in his hand before he'd finished reading the last line. He dialed the number on the letterhead, his pulse pounding.
The voice on the other end was crisp. Patricia Morales.
He tried to keep his voice level. "This is Eric Hayes. I just got a letter claiming you own my sauce recipe."
Patricia's reply was frozen steel. The mark is valid. Our client has held the trademark since 1988.
Eric's jaw clenched. He slammed the receiver down, the sound echoing off the kitchen walls.
He stared at the letter again. "Whoever owns this mark is going to regret picking a fight with my kitchen."
The restaurant closed, but the anger didn't fade. Eric went home to his apartment, needing to prove the recipe was his. In the back of his closet, a cardboard box held his mother's things: old photos, letters, and a yellowed recipe card he'd kept since she died.
He pulled out the card. His mother's handwriting, faded but unmistakable. "Mom's special sauce." He read the ingredients aloud, the words tasting of memory. "Garlic, paprika, brown sugar." His voice faltered.
The measurements matched his own recipe exactly. The same proportions, the same secret touch he'd credited to his own genius.
His stomach dropped. "This isn't mine. It was hers. It was always hers." He traced the faded cursive, feeling like a thief.
The card was dated 1962, decades before he ever stood in a kitchen, before his father even met his mother.
He whispered to the empty room, "All these years, I've been passing off my grandmother's recipe as my own creation. His father must have known. Why had he never said a single word?"
The rage that had fueled him hours before dissolved into a cold, confusing shame he couldn't name. Across town, John had not moved from his chair since the afternoon. The light in his living room faded to gray.
His mind circled back to the cemetery, to the rain, to the last time he saw Eric's face up close.
John had blamed Eric for not arriving sooner. Eric had fired back a truth that still cut. "Mom died, and you weren't there either."
He replayed the scene like a worn cassette, each time finding a new regret to add to the mountain. He had always intended to tell Eric about the trademark, but the silence grew a gravity of its own, year after year.
Now the letter was out, a legal grenade in his son's hands, and the phone on the table was stubbornly silent.
He could almost hear Grace's voice. "Johnny, family is more important than any recipe." But he had let pride speak louder.
The clock on the mantel ticked, a metronome for his regret. He didn't know if Eric would call, or if this would be the final silence. Outside, the streetlights flickered on, and John finally stood, his knees aching from the cold weight. But he didn't reach for the phone. Instead, he walked to the window and stared into the distance, waiting for what he couldn't summon himself. Eric didn't sleep. The recipe card lay on his nightstand, a silent accusation. At dawn, he called Patricia Morales.
"Patricia, this is Eric Hayes again. I need to speak to my father. Please."
Patricia listened, her voice steady. He'll want to hear this.
She called John immediately. The phone rang in his quiet house, breaking the stillness.
"John," Eric called. "He says he wants to talk."
John's voice was dry. "Tell him I'll meet him. Your office. Tomorrow."
Patricia relayed the agreement. A morning meeting was set.
Eric stared at his phone after the call. What am I going to say to him?
John hung up and stood motionless. 8 years of silence, and now a meeting he wasn't sure he was ready for. Both men would spend the night rehearsing words they could never quite get right. The next morning, John walked into Patricia's office building, a manila folder under his arm. The conference room was empty and cold. He sat down at the long glass table and waited.
His thoughts were louder than the hum of the lights. I haven't been this close to him in 8 years.
He adjusted the folder, the trademark certificate inside a shield he was prepared to lay down. The door opened. Eric stepped inside, his chef whites replaced by a plain jacket, his face unreadable.
Eric's first instinct was to look away, but he forced his eyes to meet his father's.
For a long moment, neither spoke. The space between them was filled with every unsaid word of the last decade. John's hands were still. Eric's jaw was tight. The clock on the wall ticked like a countdown. Patricia entered quietly, taking a seat at the head of the table. A notepad, her only barrier. The silence in that room was a language neither Hayes had forgotten, and it said more than either was ready to speak.
You trademarked my sauce? You sent that attorney after me?
Your grandmother's, 1988.
John slid the yellowed trademark certificate across the glass. The date was printed in bold, before Eric was even born.
This can't be. 1988. I wasn't even alive. This was never mine.
I always meant to tell you, Eric. After your mother passed, the silence just swallowed everything.
The harsh edge in Eric's voice crumbled. He wasn't the wronged inventor. He'd been using a family legacy without even knowing it.
Why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me build a whole restaurant on this?
I am not here to destroy you. I wanted to protect what Grace started, and finally talk to my son.
Eric put his head in his hands, the fight gone. The legal letter wasn't an attack. It was a father's broken attempt at connection. Patricia watched the two men, the air in the room suddenly heavier with grief than anger.
Your grandmother Grace made this sauce in our kitchen with nothing but love and a wooden spoon.
His voice was sandpaper and honey. He described the aroma, the laughter, the whispered promise that the recipe would stay in the family.
Trademark was my way of keeping her close. I never meant to keep it from you this long.
John opened the folder and placed a small framed photo beside the certificate. Eric picked it up, his fingers brushing the glass.
The licensing offer is straightforward. Royalties, credit, or rebrand. John insists no lawsuit.
She slid a crisp document toward Eric, a silver pen resting precisely on the signature line.
I need a few days. This is a lot to process.
Take the time. I've waited 8 years. A few more days won't break me.
The room no longer felt like a battlefield. The old certificate still lay on the table, now looking less like a weapon and more like a bridge.
I'll call you.
Eric walked through the front door of his apartment, the evening light catching the exhaustion on his face.
Melanie, the sauce. It's not mine. It was my grandmother's. She named it Sauce Magnifique decades ago.
What? How did you find out?
He told her everything. The letter, the phone call, the discovery of his mother's recipe card, and the meeting with John.
So your father trademarked the sauce in 1988 and never told you. And after all these years, he didn't sue, he offered you a deal.
He said it was his way of keeping his mother close. I've been selling a family heirloom and calling it my own.
Maybe this is his way back, Eric. Not a punishment. A door he's been trying to open since the funeral.
Eric looked at the recipe card Melanie had placed on the coffee table earlier. It felt different now. Less like an accusation, more like an invitation.
I could rename the dish for Grace. Give her the credit she never got.
That sounds like the right thing to do. For her, for you, and for your dad.
The next morning, Eric dialed Patricia's number before his coffee had cooled.
Patricia, it's Eric. I'll agree to the licensing deal, but I need to talk to my father again. Alone, no law office.
I'll let him know. Hold the line.
Seconds later, John's phone rang in his living room. He picked it up cautiously.
John, Eric says yes to the license, but he wants to meet face to face, just the two of you.
Tell him I'll be there. There's a cafe on Maple Street, noon.
Patricia relayed the address. Eric heard it, and his chest tightened. The place was a few blocks from the cemetery.
He chose Maple Street, right where we used to stop after visiting Mom's grave.
John hung up and looked at the photograph of Grace on his mantle. This was the moment he'd paid 40 years of silence to reach. Across town, Eric set his phone down. The meeting later that day would be the first honest conversation they'd had since the funeral. A few hours later, John was already at the cafe on Maple Street when Eric arrived. 2 cups of black coffee sat between them, untouched. Eric looked at his father's hands, still folded, the same hands that had taught him to tie a tie.
I found Mom's recipe card. In her handwriting, I realized it wasn't mine.
She would have wanted you to have it. That's what the trademark was always about, keeping it in the family.
John's voice cracked as he told a story about Grace, how she'd hummed while stirring, how she'd said the sauce was her way of hugging people.
I want to rename the dish for her. Not because you are asking, because it's right. Grace's secret sauce.
She would have loved that.
John reached across the table and covered Eric's hand with his. The gesture said more than 8 years of silence.
What if instead of royalties, we create a Grace Hayes Culinary Scholarship? The sauce could fund it.
That's exactly what I'd hoped for. Now let's make it official.
That evening, Eric walked into his apartment with a smile Melanie hadn't seen in months.
We're renaming the dish for Grace, and instead of royalties, we're starting a culinary scholarship in her name.
Your dad agreed to that?
He suggested it, actually. It was the first real conversation we've had since Mom died.
Melanie pulled him into a hug, and for a moment, the weight of the past weeks seemed to lift. Across town, John sat in his study, the old trademark certificate resting beside the photo of Grace. He uncapped a pen and wrote a simple note. For the Grace Hayes Culinary Scholarship, may it feed more than stomachs.
She would have loved this more than any royalty check.
He folded the note, set it with the checkbook, and turned off the light. The next morning, they would meet at Patricia's office to make it official. For the first time in years, both men looked forward to it. In the same conference room, John and Eric signed the licensing agreement side by side. The pen strokes were quiet, but the air shifted.
Congratulations. You are now partners in a family legacy.
They shook hands across the table, the grip firmer than it had been in decades. Before leaving the building, Eric was already on his phone, ordering new menus with the renamed dish. Within days, the new menus arrived, now featuring a short story about the grandmother who created the sauce. Eric posted the news on social media. This recipe has always belonged to my grandmother, Grace. Honored to finally give her the credit she deserves. The response was immediate. Hundreds of shares, food bloggers picking up the story of the trademark that healed a family. Patricia read the news article at her desk and allowed herself a rare, quiet smile. The case had ended exactly as she'd hoped. John watched the post go viral from his armchair, Grace's photograph beside him on the side table. Everything was in place. Only one thing remained, for John to walk through the restaurant doors and taste it for himself. A week after the social media buzz, Savor and Spice held an official relaunch. A cloth banner hung by the entrance, now featuring Grace Hayes' secret sauce. Eric stood before a small local television crew. Chef White's pressed, a nervous energy behind his eyes.
This dish belongs to my grandmother, Grace Hayes. She created it in her kitchen decades ago.
John watched from his armchair, the tablet propped on his knee. Eric's voice came through, strong and certain.
That's my boy.
Eric continued, thanking his father. My dad held onto this recipe like a promise. Today, I am honored to finally share it with the world. As the broadcast cut to a commercial, John's phone rang. Patricia's name flashed on the screen.
You did it, John. The whole city knows it's a family recipe now.
So did Eric. That's the part that matters.
He hung up and looked at Grace's photograph. The recipe was safe, the family was healing, and he was almost ready. Weeks after the relaunch, a cream-colored envelope arrived at John's house. Inside was the first royalty check from the restaurant, the new dish name printed clearly.
This was never about money. It was about her.
He set the check aside, uncapped his pen, and wrote a note on the back of an old receipt. Eric, put this toward the Grace Hayes Culinary Scholarship. Dad, without hesitation, he sealed the note and check into an envelope and dropped it in the mailbox on the corner. A day later, the same envelope landed on Eric's desk at the restaurant. Eric tore it open, and the check fell onto his desk. He read his father's short message.
He didn't cash a cent. He put it all back into her name.
By the end of the day, John was putting on his cap, heart beating with a quiet decision. It was time. The following Sunday was quiet, the kind of morning that asks nothing of a man. John walked the few blocks alone, his cap pulled low. The banner for Grace Hayes' secret sauce hung near the door. He paused, then pushed inside.
She used to say sauce was just a way to feed a memory.
A waitress came, and without opening the menu, he simply said, "Grace Hayes original sauce, please." When the plate arrived, the familiar aroma hit him first. It was the smell of her kitchen on Sundays. He lifted the fork, his hand steady for the first time in weeks. The taste was exactly right. Not almost right. It was 1955 in his mouth. A tear traced a path down his cheek, but his lips curved into a quiet, private smile. No one recognized him. The restaurant hummed on, tables filling around him, but for John, the noise had faded. All he could hear was his mother humming. A server slipped into the kitchen and murmured to Eric that an old man in the corner had ordered the family dish and closed his eyes like it meant something. Eric's hands stopped moving. He stepped to the pass window and peered out. Then he saw him. He wiped his hands on a towel and walked out into the dining room, his heart beating with a feeling he hadn't named yet. John looked up as the chair across from him pulled back. Eric sat down, and for a long moment, neither spoke. The hum of the restaurant filled the space between them, a comfortable silence that neither felt the need to break.
How is it?
Perfect.
Eric's shoulders dropped. The tension he'd carried since the first phone call finally loosened. They shared a quiet smile, the kind that needed no explanation. The first real peace in years settled over that corner table. John walked to the counter and paid his bill in cash, leaving a tip that was more than generous. The server gave a grateful smile, unaware that this quiet man had filled the restaurant with far more than sauce. He made his way toward the exit, the warm chatter of diners fading behind him. At the threshold, he stopped and looked back. His eyes found the menu board, now forever changed to honor his mother. That calm, knowing half-smile, the one he'd worn since the very beginning, settled on his face. Then he pushed the door open and stepped into the afternoon sun. He walked down the familiar street, the banner for Grace Hayes, original sauce, fluttering behind him. The recipe had always been his to protect, and now the story belonged to both of them. The recipe was always his. Now, so was the story.